A policy window has opened because of COVID. A policy window has opened because of China's aggression on our borders. And I think that policy window is a really important thing to take advantage of for India. A policy window is when the problem, the solution, and the timing come together. So I think that there's a really, really important opportunity for us to do education reform, for us to do compliance reform, for us to do banking reform, for us to do urbanization reform, and obviously for us to just think about industrialization, which is not really manufacturing, but the farm to non-farm transition. I quickly spent a few seconds on each. The compliance reform is obvious to all of us. There are 68,000 compliances for employers. There are 6,000 filings, and they are changing about 8 times a day, which means 6,000 times a year. Now, obviously, this whole universe, no single employer is subject to it. But basically, your compliance complexity compounds with geography, compounds with size, and compounds with headcount. And that doesn't make sense and that is probably one of the reasons why 63 million enterprises only end up in 22,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. But what most people don't realize is 8,000 out of these 67,000 compliances prescribe jail. One of the most interesting lines in the Vishnu Sahasranam roughly translates to saying, why did God create fear? So he could take it away. Why are there 8,000 compliances? So that, it leads to corruption. It leads to lots of problems with employers not scaling because bureaucrats can be corrupt because they can throw you in jail for what really should be civil offenses, not criminal offenses. So compliance reform is, if we want to attract factory refugees, we need to reduce the transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. Many of us in India have made peace with this, saying labor laws are a thorn in the flesh, they are not a dagger in the heart. But for somebody sitting in Seattle or somebody sitting in London or somebody sitting in Berlin, they will look at Indian law and how it is written, not how it is interpreted, practiced, and enforced. And how the Indian law is written is really, really difficult for employers. So compliance reform is really, really important. I think we've captured a lot of education reform, the new education policy. I think it represents a good vision for the next 10, 15 years. There will obviously be key of execution, so I don't need to cover that, but it has enough for school, college, and vocational training. I think financialization, which Ritu also talked about, is really important because our credit to GDP ratio is 50%. It needs to be 100%. I think China's 300% is wrong. But India had 97 banks in 1947. We only have 94 banks, scheduled commercial banks today. So we need to raise the number of banks. We need to raise competition. We need to raise governance so that I think the pain of MSMEs and migrants would have been much lower if our credit to GDP ratio was 100% rather than 50%. That's quite obvious. I think urbanization reform is an interesting question, right? That many people are giving up on offices. But that's like giving up on cities. New York's GDP is more than Russia, with 6% of the people and 0.0000005% of the land. For a reason, there are benefits to coming together. Creativity and productivity. And India only has 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China has 375. But I think it's probably a mistake to position this as a conflict between state and center. Indira Gandhi in 15 of her speeches said strong states lead to a weak nation. N.T. Rama Rao often used to say the central government is a conceptual myth. India is run by chief ministers. I think both of them were wrong. I think we need a strong center and we need strong states. So in sort of wrapping up here, if we think about industrialization as the final point, we talked about financialization, we talked about urbanization, we talked about formalization, which is compliance reform, and we talked about urbanization. Industrialization is really the farm to non-farm transition, which is really the biggest mistake in 1991. In 1991, we obviously left out corruption. We obviously left out formalization. I think we left out education. But the most important single goal should have been is the only way to help farmers is to have less of them. And that is really why India is not as free as it is independent, because 45% of our labor force works on farms and it only generates 14% of our GDP. And the notion that we should shove more people into farms, or I hear this silly notion that because of COVID, all the migrants have gone back to farms and suddenly rural demand will increase. Well, that's not going to happen. So I think the only way to help farmers is to have less of them. And the agricultural reforms done recently are very important around sort of essential service, around the Essential Commodities Act and many things else. So I think that in policy change, what we have learned at TeamLease is there is a difference between the list of ingredients and the recipe. There is clearly a difference between being idealistic and being practical. So life is second best at best, as Avinash Dikshit, who's one of my favorite professors at Princeton, reminds us about reforms. And obviously, we need to think about a collective action failure among employers. I have often fought with many of the industry associations where I say, as an individual company, yes, I want to tweak customs, I want to get this change for me, I want to reduce excise, I want to get rid of labor laws, but we need to be pro-market. We don't want to be pro-business. Much of business has lost its credibility because it's of its naked self-interest rather than national development. I think self-interest is a great motivator, but I think we need to move beyond saying that, give me an opportunity as this company to be successful, to saying, let's give our economy a chance to be successful. And that happens when you have a competitive economy, when you have a meritocratic banking system, when you have a rules-based compliance system. And I think that is really what was missing. But I think that, it's a unique time. We've probably got more talk about labor reform, more talk about banking reform, more talk about ease of doing business reform, more agricultural reform, more education reform in the last sort of 6 months than we have got in a long time before that. And that really represents the COVID policy window.